The thermometer outside Walter Kemper's kitchen window read minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit at 4:47 a.m. on Christmas morning, 1968. Walter stood at that window in his long underwear and wool socks, coffee cup steaming in his hand, watching his breath fog the glass as he looked out at what was shaping up to be one of the coldest Christmas days in South Dakota history. The wind had finally died down after 3 days of howling across the prairie, but the temperature had plummeted in that special way it does when the sky clears after a blizzard and the stars seem close enough to touch. Walter wasn't admiring the beauty. He was calculating whether his cattle had enough hay to make it through another day, and whether the water tank heaters had kept working through the night. 3 miles east, in a newer ranch-style house with better insulation and central heating, Walter's neighbor Ron Christensen was also awake, but for different reasons. Ron's phone had rung at 4:15, his hired man calling from the barn to report that the automatic waters had frozen despite the heaters, and that several cattle were showing signs of stress from the cold. Ron had dressed quickly and tried to start his nearly new 1967 International Harvester 806 diesel to get out to the pasture. The tractor had turned over a few times, groaned, and died. The battery was good. The fuel was winterized diesel. Everything should have worked. But at minus 22 degrees, should have worked, and did work were two very different things. Before we go any further, you need to understand what minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit actually means for internal combustion engines, especially diesel engines of the 1960s. According to engineering specifications from that era, diesel fuel begins to gel, meaning the paraffin wax in it starts to solidify, at around 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit for standard number 2 diesel. At minus 20, you're well below that threshold. The fuel thickens into something closer to syrup or even jelly, making it impossible to flow through fuel lines and injectors. Battery capacity drops by 50% or more in extreme cold. A battery that could crank 200 amps at 70 degrees might only deliver 80 to 100 amps at minus 20. Engine oil, even multi-weight oils that were relatively new in the 1960s, becomes viscous and resistant. Starting a diesel tractor in these conditions without engine block heaters, battery warmers, or other cold weather equipment was somewhere between very difficult and impossible. Gasoline engines had their own problems in extreme cold, but they were generally more forgiving than diesels. The fuel didn't gel, for one thing. The ignition system on older gasoline tractors was simple, magneto or battery power distributor, and could function at extreme temperatures if the components were sound. The main challenges were oil viscosity, battery capacity, and getting enough volatile gasoline vapor into cylinders to ignite. Walter Kemper's primary tractor in December 1968 was a 1948 Farmall M, a gasoline power tractor that was 20 years old and had somewhere north of 8,000 hours on the meter, though the meter had stopped working accurately around 1959. The Farmall M was introduced in 1939 and produced through 1952. Representing International Harvester's most popular row crop tractor of that generation. It produced about 36 horsepower at the belt, ran on gasoline, had a 4-cylinder engine, and weighed around 5,200 pounds. By 1968, it was thoroughly obsolete, outdated by the diesel revolution, the power revolution, the comfort revolution that had swept through American agriculture in the 1950s and 60s. Walter had bought the Farmall M used in 1953 for $850. He'd maintained it meticulously, changed the oil religiously, replaced worn parts before they failed, and kept it in a 3-sided shed when it wasn't working. By 1968, he'd put maybe $1,200 total into that tractor over 15 years. It was slow, uncomfortable, loud, and completely paid for. Ron Christensen's International 806, by contrast, was a modern marvel, introduced in 1963. The 806 was part of the new generation of diesel tractors that revolutionized farming in the 1960s. It put out 85 horsepower from a 6-cylinder diesel engine, had a torque amplifier transmission, live hydraulics, power steering, and could pull a 5-bottom plow through anything. Ron had bought his in the spring of 1967 for just over $9,000, financed through the dealer at 7.75% interest over 5 years. It was painted bright international red, had less than 700 hours on it, and represented everything modern agriculture was supposed to be. On Christmas morning 1968, Ron's 806 was a $9,000 lawn ornament. The diesel had gelled, the battery was struggling, and no amount of cranking was going to make that engine fire. Walter, meanwhile, had pulled on his insulated coveralls, his pock boots rated to -40, his thick gloves, and his wool cap with the ear flaps, and had walked out to that three-sided shed where the Farmall M sat waiting. He'd done something the night before that old-timers all across the northern plains did routinely, but that younger farmers often dismissed as unnecessary fussing. He drained the radiator completely and put the water in 5-gallon buckets in the barn where it wouldn't freeze. He'd pulled the battery and brought it into the house, setting it near the wood stove to keep it warm. He'd put a piece of cardboard over the grill to block wind, and he'd positioned a small kerosene salamander heater, the kind construction workers use, under the engine, letting it run for 3 hours before he needed to start the tractor. These weren't innovations. These were standard cold weather practices that farmers who'd worked through the 1930s and 40s knew by heart, before engine block heaters were common, before winterized fuel was reliably available, before batteries were as robust as they'd become by the late 60s. At 5:15 a.m., Walter carried that warm battery out to the shed, installed it, poured 5 gallons of warm water into the radiator. He'd heated it on the kitchen stove and made sure the engine oil wasn't too thick to flow. Then he pulled out the choke, set the throttle, checked that the transmission was in neutral, and hit the starter. The Farmall M turned over slowly, that thick oil fighting every revolution, groaned, coughed, and fired. That 4-cylinder engine caught with a roar that echoed across the frozen prairie, black smoke pouring from the exhaust as the cold engine struggled to find its rhythm. Walter let it idle for 10 minutes, letting the oil warm and circulate, letting the engine find its operating temperature, before he put it in gear and headed out to his cattle. The cattle operation Walter ran wasn't large by modern standards, about 80 head of Hereford cows on 480 acres of prairie grassland and cropland in Tripp County, South Dakota. Tripp County sits in the south-central part of the state, where the prairie starts to roll and break, where farming gives way to ranching, where the winters can kill you if you're not prepared. Walter's grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1904. His father had held on to it through the Depression, and Walter had taken over in 1952 when his father's health failed. Walter's operation was built on a principle that seemed increasingly outdated by 1968. Minimal debt, minimal expenses, maximum self-reliance. While neighbors were buying new tractors, new trucks, building new barns with automated feeding systems, Walter made do with the old Farmall, a 1951 Chevrolet pickup that he'd rebuilt the engine on twice, and a barn his grandfather had built from local timber and sweat. His total debt in December 1968 was zero. His annual operating expenses were probably less than $5,000. His profit margins were thin, but they were reliable. Ron Christensen represented a different philosophy entirely. Ron was 34 in 1968, college-educated from South Dakota State University's agriculture program, and he believed in what the extension agents and agricultural economists were teaching: efficiency through mechanization, economies of scale, leveraging equity to expand. Ron had started with 320 acres he'd inherited from his father, but by 1968 he was farming 1,280 acres. His original land plus 3/4 sections he'd bought or leased using the equity in his operation. He ran 250 head of cattle, had invested in genetic improvements, had built a modern barn with automated waterers and feeding equipment. His operation grossed probably $120,000 a year, but his operating expenses and debt service ate up most of it. He was positioned for growth, for the future, for the kind of agriculture that was supposed to define the 1970s. But on Christmas morning 1968, with his modern tractor frozen and his automated watering system failed, Ron was in trouble. I want to hear from people who lived through winters like this. What was it like farming in extreme cold before modern equipment? What tricks did your family use to get equipment started? Share your memories in the comments, because what happened that Christmas morning in Tripp County was repeated across every northern state: Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming. Anywhere the temperature dropped below -10 and stayed there for days. By 6:30 a.m., Walter had reached his cattle with the Farmall M pulling a hay wagon. The cattle were bunched in the lee of a windbreak he'd planted 20 years earlier, Russian olive trees in Carolina that broke the wind and created a microclimate several degrees warmer than the open prairie. Walter broke out hay bales, checked the tank heater, still working, thank God, and counted heads. All 80 cows were accounted for, none showing serious distress. The preparation he'd done before the storm had worked. Ron, meanwhile, was stuck. His 806 wouldn't start despite an hour of trying. His automated waterers were frozen. His hired man was exhausted from trying to manually water 250 head of cattle using buckets and breaking ice. At 7:15 a.m., Ron did something that hurt his pride, but was necessary. He called Walter. "Walter, it's Ron. I know it's Christmas morning. I know you've got your own work, but I'm in a bind here. My 800 SIXS frozen solid. My watering system's down, and I've got cattle that need attention. Any chance you could help me out?" Walter had been expecting the call, or one like it. He'd seen the lights on at Ron's place since before dawn, had heard the repeated starter cranking carrying across the frozen prairie, in that way sound travels on still, cold air. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Walter said. "Got some things that might help." What Walter brought to Ron's place that morning was more valuable than equipment. It was knowledge that couldn't be bought at any dealership. He brought a Herman Nelson heater, a portable forced air heater that ran on kerosene and could be directed at an engine block. He brought battery jumper cables and the know-how to actually warm a frozen diesel engine enough to start. He brought suggestions about adding kerosene to the diesel fuel to thin it out, about wrapping the fuel lines in burlap and pouring hot water over them to liquefy gel fuel, about patience and technique that modern farming had started to forget. It took 3 hours, but they got the 806 started. By then it was mid-morning on Christmas Day. The temperature had warmed to -15, and both men were exhausted. Ron's wife brought out thermoses of coffee, and the two men sat in Ron's warm barn, trying to restore feeling to their fingers and toes. "That old Farmall of yours just started right up, didn't it?" Ron asked, though he already knew the answer. "It did," Walter said, "but that's not magic. That's just different technology and different preparation." What Walter explained to Ron that morning is something that agricultural engineers understood then, but that got lost in the rush to modernize. Gasoline engines have inherent advantages in extreme cold compared to diesels. The fuel doesn't gel. The ignition system is simpler. The fuel vaporizes more readily. And older tractors like the Farmall M, were designed in an era when farmers routinely dealt with extreme cold without modern conveniences. So the engineering reflected that reality. Diesel tractors like the 806 were more efficient, more powerful, more economical to operate in normal conditions. But they required infrastructure, block heaters plugged into electrical outlets, fuel additives, battery warmers, sometimes even heated storage buildings. For farmers who had that infrastructure, diesels were superior in almost every way. For farmers who didn't, or for conditions where the infrastructure failed, the old gasoline tractors had a resilience that modern equipment couldn't match. This isn't romanticism. This is documented in agricultural engineering studies from the era. A 1965 study by the University of Minnesota Extension Service on cold weather tractor operation noted that gasoline tractors could reliably start at temperatures 20 degrees lower than diesel tractors without supplemental heating. But diesels were so much more economical and powerful in normal operation that the industry was moving entirely toward diesel power. The assumption was that farmers would adapt their infrastructure to handle the cold start challenges. The assumption worked fine until infrastructure failed. Then you needed a backup plan, and the best backup plan was often equipment that didn't need infrastructure. The rest of Christmas Day, 1968, was spent dealing with the aftermath of the cold. Walter checked his cattle again in the afternoon, broke ice on water tanks that the heaters couldn't quite keep up with, added bedding to the shelter areas. Ron dealt with frozen pipes in his barn, cattle that had gotten frostbite on their ears and tails, equipment that needed to be thawed and restarted. But that night, sitting in his kitchen with his wife Helen and their 2 kids, who'd been waiting patiently to open presents until Dad finished with the emergency, Walter thought about what the day had taught him and what it might mean. The Farmall M had started because it was simple, because it was gasoline, and because Walter had prepared it properly. The 806 had failed because it was complex, because it was diesel, and because the infrastructure required had failed. Neither tractor was inherently better or worse. They were tools designed for different contexts. The question was, what context were they actually living in? Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, that question became increasingly important across northern agriculture. According to National Weather Service records, the winter of 1968 to 69 was one of the coldest in the northern plains in decades. Numerous days across South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana saw temperatures below -20, with wind chills, though that term wasn't commonly used then, making it feel even colder. Farmers everywhere faced what Ron had faced, modern equipment that couldn't handle the conditions. The response varied. Some farmers, like Ron, invested in more infrastructure, heated shops, block heater systems, better fuel additives, battery blankets. They made the modern equipment work by creating the environment it needed. Other farmers, like Walter, kept old gasoline tractors as backup, insurance against a day when the power went out or the temperature dropped so low that even the best infrastructure couldn't help. By the mid-1970s, the industry had largely solved the cold start problem for diesels. Block heaters became standard equipment. Fuel additives improved dramatically. Battery technology advanced. Synthetic oils that flowed better in cold temperatures became available. The 1968 Christmas morning scenario became increasingly rare, not because the weather got warmer, but because the technology and infrastructure got better. But here's what didn't change. The farmers who survived the agricultural crisis of the 1980s, that devastating period we've talked about in other stories, were disproportionately the farmers who'd maintained some version of Walter's philosophy. Not necessarily keeping old tractors, but maintaining low debt, keeping infrastructure simple enough to manage, avoiding dependency on systems that could fail catastrophically. Ron Christensen made it through the 1980s, but barely. His debt load from expansion years, combined with falling commodity prices and rising interest rates, nearly broke him. He survived by selling off 2 of his leased quarter sections, radically simplifying his operation, and going back to a scale he could manage without leverage. By 1990, he was farming about the same acreage Walter had always farmed, but with 30 years of hard lessons learned. Walter kept farming until 1985, when he was 72 and his knees finally gave out from decades of climbing on and off tractors and hauling hay bales. He sold the cattle operation to a neighbor and rented out the cropland. The Farmall M went to his grandson, who restored it and still brings it to tractor shows across South Dakota. At those shows, when old-timers gather around that 1948 Farmall with its faded red paint and worn but functional components, someone always tells a story about starting a tractor in extreme cold, about the Christmas morning or January blizzard, when the old iron saved the day while the modern equipment sat frozen. These stories aren't just nostalgia. They're lessons about appropriate technology, about matching tools to context, about understanding that newer isn't always better in every situation. Every technical detail I'm sharing with you, the engine specifications, the cold start challenges, the fuel gelling temperatures, it's all pulled from agricultural engineering reports, equipment manuals, and university extension studies from the 1960s. This isn't folklore. It's documented mechanical reality. And the economic patterns, the debt loads, the expansion fever followed by crisis, that's all from USDA data and Federal Reserve agricultural lending reports. Here's what I want you to think about. In your own life, where are you dependent on complex systems that could fail catastrophically? Where have you traded resilience for efficiency? Where could simple, paid-off, older technology provide better backup than complicated, financed, modern systems? These questions apply far beyond farming. They apply to vehicles, homes, businesses, any aspect of life where we've made ourselves dependent on infrastructure and complexity. The lesson of that Christmas morning in 1968 isn't that old tractors are better than new ones. It's that resilience comes from having options, from maintaining the ability to function when the optimal system fails. If you're getting value from these historically grounded stories about American agriculture, hit that subscribe button because I research each one thoroughly to preserve this history accurately. Every story I tell is anchored in real economic data, real equipment specifications, real historical context. This isn't mass-produced content. It's preservation of agricultural history that matters. Walter Kemper died in 2003 at 90 years old. His obituary in the Winter Advocate newspaper noted that he'd farmed the same land his grandfather homesteaded, that he'd never miss a payment on anything in his life because he'd never bought anything he couldn't pay cash for, and that he'd helped neighbors through countless crises with his time, equipment, and knowledge. The obituary didn't mention the Christmas morning of 1968, but the people who'd been there remembered. Ron Christensen is still alive, retired now in Winter, South Dakota. When I talked to him for this story, he brought up that Christmas morning without prompting. Walter saved my operation that day, Ron said, not just by helping me start that 806, but by showing me that there was a different way to think about farming. I was so focused on being modern, on having the newest equipment, on expanding, that I'd forgotten the basics. Sometimes the newest technology is just a way to fail faster and more expensively. That's a hard lesson to learn on Christmas morning at minus 22 degrees, but it's a lesson that stuck. The Farmall M that started that morning is still running 75 years after it was built. The International 806 that wouldn't start was eventually sold in the early 1980s when Ron downsized his operation. I tried to track it down but couldn't find it, probably scrapped decades ago or rusting in a fence row somewhere. The difference in longevity isn't because the 806 was a bad tractor. It was excellent, but because the context changed. The Farmall became valued for its simplicity and reliability. The 806 became just another used diesel tractor in an era of rapidly advancing technology. Here's my challenge for you. Share in a comment a time when simple, old technology saved the day when modern systems failed. It doesn't have to be farming. It could be anything. A hand pump when the electric well pump failed. A wood stove when the power went out. A manual transmission truck that started when the automatic wouldn't. These stories matter because they remind us that progress isn't always linear, that newer isn't always better, and that sometimes the most valuable asset is something that just works, regardless of whether it's sophisticated. The temperature in Tripp County, South Dakota on Christmas morning 1968 eventually reached a high of minus 8 degrees. By modern standards, with modern equipment and infrastructure, that's manageable. But in 1968, with the technology and infrastructure of that era, it was a genuine test of equipment, preparation, and philosophy. Walter Kemper passed that test with a 20-year-old tractor that cost $850 and represented obsolete technology. Ron Christensen failed it with a 1-year-old tractor that cost $9,000 and represented the future of agriculture. The question both men had to answer afterward was, what does that teach us? For Walter, it confirmed what he already believed, that debt-free, simple, reliable equipment that you understood completely was better than finance, complex, powerful equipment that you depended on but couldn't fix yourself. For Ron, it started a process of reevaluation that took years to complete, but eventually led him to a more balanced approach, using modern technology where it made sense, but maintaining backup systems, keeping debt manageable, and never forgetting that complexity creates vulnerability. Both men were right. Both men were successful farmers by their own definitions. But only one of them slept well on Christmas night 1968, confident that he'd handled the crisis with tools and knowledge he completely controlled. That's the story of Christmas morning 1968, when the temperature was minus 22 degrees, when the modern diesel tractors froze solid, and when a 20-year-old gasoline Farmall started on the first crank and saved the day. The lesson isn't that you should farm with antique equipment. The lesson is that you should understand your equipment completely, prepare for failure, maintain systems that can function when infrastructure fails, and never become so dependent on complexity that you can't survive when it breaks down. Because eventually, complexity always breaks down. The only question is whether you have a backup plan when it does. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about your own experiences with equipment failure and resilience. And remember, the best tractor is the one that starts when you need it, regardless of how old it is or what it cost. That's what Walter Kemper knew on Christmas morning 1968. And that's what saved his operation while his neighbors failed.